Hello, my name is Karen Vuranch, and I'm going to be doing Gertrude Bell for Oklahoma, Chautauqua. Now, I'm guessing there's a lot of you who don't know of this remarkable and amazing woman. Gertrude Bell was from Yorkshire, England, but she was an expert on the desert and Middle East culture. She lived, this is about World War I era, and prior to the war, she traveled all over the desert. She met tribal leaders, Arab chieftains. She could speak Bedouin, Farsi, Arabic, among the 11 languages she could speak. And she became an expert. She mapped the deserts and created the first reliable maps of the deserts of the Middle East. During World War I, she was brought to the Middle East and became the first woman officer in the British intelligence service. She served as a liaison with all the tribal chieftains, and because she could speak their language and because they trusted her. It was said that she was the only English-speaking person that Middle Easterners really trusted. After World War I, she stays in Baghdad and helps to create the government of modern Iraq. She was truly remarkable. In addition to those achievements, she was an archaeologist, a photographer, a spy, a writer. She wrote 7 books about her experiences in the Middle East and a white paper that she wrote for the British government that's considered to be a masterpiece. She was awarded the Gold Medal of the Royal Geographic Society for her explorations of the desert and archaeological achievements. She was the first woman to graduate from Oxford with first honors. She received a CBE, a Commander of the Order of the British Empire. Oh yeah, and she's a mountain climber, and there is an Alp named after her. Truly an amazing Renaissance woman who lived in the late 1800s and early 1900s. When I do my performance for you under the tent, God willing, next summer, I will be telling the stories of how all of her work in the Middle East. I won't have time to talk about the things that influenced her early in her life. What created this remarkable woman who could go out into the world and make such significant changes? So that is what I want to talk to you about right now, is the things that influenced Gertrude Bell. First and foremost, I think, is the time period in which she lived. She was born in the Victorian times. The Victorian era is identified as the time when Queen Victoria was the monarch from 1837 to 1901 in England. And Gertrude Bell was born smack in the middle, 1868, right in the middle of this. It's a time when England was the most powerful nation in the world. It was a time of stern morality, self-discipline, and hard work. Women's roles were clearly defined. To be a good woman was to be a good wife and mother, and men ran the world, which is ironic because their monarch was a woman. They were also known at that time for their imperialism. Britain went out and had many colonies, and they sort of had this feeling that they were custodians of the universe and had a duty to protect the natives, uphold trade, create economic revival, spread morality. It was very much a sense of white privilege, certainly. The other thing that's a hallmark of the Victorian age is the Industrial Revolution. I don't know if you remember when England hosted the Olympics, but when a country hosts the Olympics, their opening ceremony, they put forth what they are most proud of. And in the English ceremony, there was this beautiful pastoral, gorgeous countryside and uprose smokestacks and buildings and industry. The Industrial Revolution, without question, begins in England. And the technology that we know today is a direct result of that early technological boom. And without question, it starts in England. It was during the Victorian time. And perhaps the foremost industrialist of the Industrial Revolution was Gertrude Bell's grandfather. His name was Isaac Lothian Bell. He was brilliant. He is as much a scientist as he is a manufacturing genius. He pioneered the use of blast furnaces to smelt iron ore. He started the first aluminum manufacturing plant in England on the day of the opening. Sir Isaac had a top hat made of aluminum, and he drove around the countryside doffing his hat. Oh, excuse me, if I was in England, I would say aluminium. They pronounce it differently there. At any rate, he and his brothers began Bell Brothers. It was they had coal mines, steel mills, and railroads, and were probably the most important of those kinds of manufacturing plants in the UK in the 1870s. They made a third of all the metal manufactured in Britain. It is said every railroad track that is laid in Britain is made from Bell Brothers foundry metal. At one time, they had more than 47,000 people working for them, and they bragged that they could make anything from a needle to a ship. So they were very wealthy. They were the sixth richest family in England. That's important. But more than being wealthy and a good businessman, Sir Isaac was also a brilliant scientist. He was a member of 8 chemical or engineering institutions and president of 5 of those. He was a fellow of the Royal Society, the most prestigious group of scientists in England, and he won the first Bessemer gold medal. He wrote scientific books that were very highly praised, and he was even called the High Priest of British Metallurgy. This was truly an important man in his day. He was, in addition to being a scientist, a brilliant businessman, he was also very committed to his community. He was mayor of Newcastle twice and held a seat in Parliament and was high sheriff of the county once as well. When Gertrude was 17 years old, her grandfather was named a baronet. Now, that's a low-ranking nobility. Here's how it goes: king, queen, then a duke, then marquess, then viscount, then baron, then baronet, and the last is knight. So it's not a high-ranking nobility, but it is nobility. But more importantly, this was earned prestige, not entitled. This wasn't handed down for generations and they felt like they were lords of the universe. He earned this very important honor. It must be said that his son, Gertrude's father, Hugh, was not happy that he was not consulted, because once you are given a baronet, that is passed down to your children. And both Gertrude and Hugh felt that nobility and aristocracy should be earned, not inherited. But at any rate, her father became a baronet, and that's when he took a seat in the House of Lords. He was very, very much an intellectual. He was in the Liberal Party in the House of Lords, and he surrounded himself with the open-minded thinkers of the day. At his home there in North Yorkshire, he had built a home, not a lavish, beautiful, opulent mansion, a modest-looking house, arts and crafts style. It was designed by none other than William Morris. And he would have people come to visit him, such as Charles Darwin, Thomas Huxley, John Ruskin, and William Morris. Gertrude was very much a part of her grandfather's household. She was born in his house, in fact. They moved away later when her father married, but or a second time. I'll get to that. And so she would have met these very, very powerful, very influential thinking people of the day, people who were thinking the new thoughts and the new ideas of the day. Now, Gertrude's father, Hugh, who I've mentioned already, was the eldest son of Sir Isaac, and he inherited the business acumen and scientific ability of his father. He studied in Edinburgh, and then he went to the Sorbonne to study chemistry, and then he went to Germany to study math and organic chemistry, all before he was 18, came home to run the Bell Brothers foundry. Eventually, he is considered to be the best authority on coal and iron trades in the UK. And he is elected mayor as well, 3 times, becomes Lord Lieutenant. Like his father, he had good business sense, but he also had good, strong sense of community. He especially believed in making his community a better place and spent much of his time going around the country giving lectures on the importance of secondary education, public health, and military reform. And he even creates the Free Library Committee in his community and Middleborough High School, state school. Now, let me clarify something here. In America, when we say a public school, we mean a school that anyone can attend and not pay money to go, and tax dollars pays for that school. In England, it means something totally different. A public school is a very much privileged, very expensive school, very elite, and only the most wealthy go to that school. It's called a public school because it's not affiliated with a religion. So in England, the school that anyone can attend is called a state school. In Ireland, it's called a national school. I like to say that England and America are 2 countries separated by a common language. At any rate, So he founded the Middleborough High School, a state school. He built libraries, he built community centers, he built good housing for his workers. He paid better money to his workers than anyone else paid. He even paid for a holiday home at the sea. They weren't far from the North Sea where they lived, but they paid for a holiday home that if a worker showed excellent work skills and excellent work ethics, they were given a paid week vacation at the seashore. This is unheard of in this time of life. I mean, people just so many people used and abused their employees. I mean, people like Charles Dickens wrote books about the horrific conditions in the factories. But Hugh Bell believed in making his place a better place to work. He even pushed through a bill through the Parliament protecting children from dangerous work. This was just not done. Children were working in appalling conditions, but Hugh Bell made sure that the children, at least in his factory, worked in safety. And the understanding in those days was that children would work, but at the same time, they had the right to work in safety and to get an education. Hugh also supported trade unions, which is important to know too, and he paid the highest wage around. He married a woman by the name of Mary Shield, and Gertrude is their firstborn child. Gertrude was born in 1868, a year after they married. And they moved to Red Barns, away from her grandfather's house, when she was 2. When she was 3, her mother died in childbirth, giving birth to her brother Maurice. As a result, Gertrude was extraordinarily close to her father. She was a very smart girl, very bright girl, and grew up very, very much loving her father, admiring her father, and that love and admiration lasted all of her life. That was a very important influence on her. And so his good work, his belief in community-minded work and making the world a better place for the people around him was passed on to Gertrude as well. When she is 8 years old, Hugh marries again a woman named Florence O'Leaf. Now, Florence was very classy. She had lived in Paris. Her father was a physician to the ambassador of Paris. He was Irish, and her mother was English. I will say she was Anglo-Irish, which means she was Protestant Irish and not of the working class land working peasants of Ireland. She was trade Ireland. She was of the trade classes in the middle. So she and Hugh were well suited for that reason, because neither were aristocracy, but both were brought up to appreciate the morals and values of the upper classes. In addition, Florence was a playwright and a writer. She wrote books. She had at least 3 plays produced in West End London, and the circle in which she ran were all writers. She was friends with Henry James. She was friends with Charles Dickens. There's a wonderful story about Charles Dickens and Florence's life. Florence was a young girl, and Charles Dickens had visited their home and enjoyed talking to her. And he was in Paris once giving a lecture, and her parents showed up and didn't bring her because they didn't think it'd be appropriate. He said, "Well, where's Florence?" And they said, "She isn't coming." He said, "Well, if Florence isn't here, I shan't be here either." And they had to quickly go home to get Florence to bring her back so Charles would give his speech. So those are the kinds of people that she knew in Paris and knew from her family friends. The one thing also about Florence is she's very stylish. She wears elegant clothing. She dresses in the highest Parisian fashions. And this has to influence Gertrude. Gertrude, all of her life, wears the most elegant clothing and has clothing made for her, especially when she's in the Middle East. She designs a split skirt so she could ride a camel or ride a horse but still look elegant. So that has to be one of the influences of Gertrude's life as well. In addition, Florence is very interested in sociology and education. She didn't want to marry Hugh at first. She said she'd never marry an Englishman. But Hugh's sisters had been caring for his orphaned children, or his motherless children. They weren't orphans yet. And so when they met Florence, they thought this would be a perfect match for Hugh because they both cared so much about social justice issues. And eventually they did marry. It could have gone bad. Gertrude was a very, very willful child. She was very strong, very determined, couldn't keep a nanny more than a year because she'd run them off. She disobeyed them all the time. She was always getting into trouble. She was always climbing things, and her brother would climb after her and he'd fall off and she'd keep climbing. And she was just really, really a strong-willed child. But to Florence's credit, She just took those two motherless children and loved them, just completely and totally loved them. And in no time at all, Gertrude is calling her mammy or calling her mother. And all of Gertrude's life, Florence is one of the most important people to her. Maybe not quite as important as her father, but certainly one of her most important influences in her life, and a good influence. Florence believed in education. Now, in those days, you always taught your children at home until the boys were old enough to go to school, but girls were taught at home by governesses. But Florence believed in education, and she believed in that children should be outdoors, they should ride horses, they should run outside. She taught them to garden. And this is important to Gertrude because Gertrude becomes an award-winning gardener. The gardens at Rounton Grange, the home they inherit from Sir Isaac, she wins an award for. And later in Baghdad, she has the only English garden in Baghdad, which must have been difficult because Baghdad gets to be about 115 degrees in the summer. So gardening was an important influence on her as well. Eventually, Florence has three children of her own. So Gertrude has three half siblings and two sisters and another brother. And as I said, they're raised at home. Her mother taught them along with governesses. Her mother was passionate about education, and it's after the children are grown that Florence hears about somebody in Italy, a woman named Maria Montessori, and Florence goes and studies with her to learn how best to teach children. Florence is passionately dedicated to making the community a better place. She and her husband together work on so many projects. For example, there's one called Winter Garden, where they create a community center that could be a place where people could gather and not be influenced by alcohol, because that was such a problem with working people. And she also interviewed all of her husband's mill workers and workers at other mills. And in 1907 wrote a very important book called At the Works, which really exposed the situation in mill towns and the horrific conditions that people lived and worked in. At that time, upper class people would look down on workers, saying, well, they're dirty and they're filthy and they can't keep their children clean. And Florence explained that with the air quality the way it was, with the long hours they worked, with the minimal access they had to water and washing, how difficult it was to do that. And she laid to rest many of the stereotypes of working people. The book maybe didn't make a difference, but it was used by friends like Charles Dickens to move forward change and social pressure. So Florence is an important influence in Gertrude's life. There was one more aspect in which Florence, in retrospect, might be a negative influence. I said Florence was friends with lots of writers. And one of her friends was a woman named Mrs. Humphrey Ward, who begins the Anti-Suffragist League. Today, when people look at Gertrude Bell, they say, oh, she was an anti-suffragist. But they don't know the whole story. First of all, Gertrude joined to honor her mother. Her mother was a member of the League, friends with Mrs. Ward. But Florence believed that a problem with giving women the vote was that many, many women were illiterate. And it would be a burden to also have to learn to read and write, and they would end up not being able to vote at all. Gertrude took it one step further. In those days, voting was tied to property rights. You had to have property to vote. And if women were given the right to vote, the only women who owned property were widows, because they had inherited from their husband, and prostitutes. Gertrude was a very wealthy woman, but she didn't own property. If women were given the right to vote, she wouldn't have voted. So she wanted to change the property rights restriction and then talk about the right to vote. Both of them had their reasons for joining the anti-suffragists. They also felt that the suffragists of the early suffragists, the Pankhurst family, were very violent, and they were violent initially. They broke store glass windows and knocked over mailboxes to try to get attention. Once World War I starts, the violence stops. But at that point, Gertrude and Florence were already members of the Anti-Suffragist League. So you have to understand the perspective that they came from before we judge whether they were anti-women's vote or pro-women. Gertrude, of course, becomes such an amazing, remarkable woman, but there were issues related to the anti-suffrage issue. But again, that might be one negative influence that Florence had on her, that in terms of the legacy that we have of Gertrude Bell. And the final influence that I think we should talk about of Gertrude's early life is her education. As I said, she was educated at home by Florence and by governesses. In those days, most women were. They would learn French and they might learn to needlepoint and to sew. They didn't learn much. They might read some poetry. That would be the extent. But Gertrude was bright. By the time she was 8 or 9 or 10 years old, she was already reading books way beyond her years, way beyond the ability she should have. And she was bright and smart. And they decided to send her to a school in London called Queen's College. It actually was the first school chartered for women. And it was, we would call it a high school, but it was, in those days, it wasn't quite the language they used. It was actually created to teach young women to be governesses so they could go and teach other children and have a career. So, but they wanted Gertrude to be exposed to further education. It is important to know that they made her take a train to London on a third-class ticket so she would arrive and not look more fancier or wealthier than the other girls. She did well. Her mother made sure that she would have wonderful experiences in London. She would go to homes like Robert Browning's house. She met with Henry James. In fact, Henry James wrote a book, The Awkward Age, and the lead character, Nanda, is said to be based on Gertrude Bell. So she certainly still continued to meet important people, important thinkers and writers, but she also was exposed to education in a different way than she would have been at home with just a governess. And these teachers recognized the fact that Gertrude was very bright and convinced her parents to send her to Oxford. Now, Oxford had only been accepting women for about 7 years before Gertrude was there. Gertrude went in 1886, and it was still very much a bastion of male superiority. Women were taught things like needlework and how to open and close doors and how to serve tea. The principal of the college she attended, Lady Margaret Hall, was Eliza Wordsworth, grandniece of the poet Wordsworth. And she was very much about helping women find a husband. And that was what she felt they were there for. Women could apply to attend academic lectures, and Gertrude applied to every one that she was permitted to attend. There's several funny stories. One of the lectures she arrived that the lecturer would not look at women, so he made them sit with their backs to them, and there were 3. Gertrude was with 2 other women. And Gertrude got a fit of the giggles and started laughing. It was so silly to be sitting with her back to the professor. And of course, she was called in for detention on it, but she said that he should have gotten the detention, not her. And she wrote home to her father. She didn't see she did anything wrong. Another time, they always had to go in pairs. You could never go by yourself. And she and another woman showed up, and there was not a single seat left in the lecture hall. So the lecturer put them on the platform with him and was very condescending and spoke down to them the whole time. And when it was done, he said, "Young ladies, did you learn anything?" And she said, "No, nothing more than when I read your book." So she didn't think anything of speaking back when the time came. Gertrude Bell graduated from Oxford in 2 years instead of 3, and she took a first in modern history. It is a first is considered a pinnacle of intellectual qualification. The requirements to get a first are you have to see beyond the accepted theories of the day, you have to explore new horizons of understanding, and you have to be able to challenge the finest minds on a subject without faltering. Those are the criteria for getting a first. And at her orals, she was known for speaking out and speaking back to the professor and defending her theses. And as a result, she was the first woman to graduate from honors with a first, which is truly an accomplishment. So in conclusion, Gertrude Bell grew up in privilege and money, but not with a sense of entitlement. She didn't grow up thinking that this was owed her, that she had white superiority. She grew up with a sense of she had money, but she also owed her community. And she grew up with a strong importance in education, a strong sense of community service and social justice. And she grew up also in a time when Victorian England believed that Britain had a responsibility to the rest of the world. And so when she finally goes to the Middle East and finds this place that she just falls in love with the landscape and the people, she has a sense of commitment and a duty, I think, to make it a better place and try to make the best it can be. Certainly being in Oxford, she learned to challenge ideas and to think for herself and to be exposed to brilliant minds, certainly in the people in her parents and grandparents' home. And her grandparents and father themselves were very bright, very intellectual, and encouraged open-minded thinking. And all of these things come together to create this woman known as Gertrude Bell. I look forward to telling you more about her life, about her mountain climbing experiences, about her time working in the desert, her time during World War I in Oklahoma, Chautauqua. Thank you very much.